Dealey Plaza, Dallas, the public arena for the brutal slaying of the 35th President of the United States. The assassination of John F. Kennedy on November the 22nd, 1963, in this tiny acre of Texas, changed history and the lives of millions. And for those closest to the tragedy, the awful memories of that day and the ensuing controversy live on.
And no one will ever convince me any differently that the shots came from the area of the picket fence on the grassy knoll. No one will ever convince me. I saw it. I believe that's where it came from. And the only way that I'm ever going to believe any different is when I stand before the judge on the judgment day and he tells me. But I know what I saw, and that's what I saw.
Major Phil Willis, with his wife and daughter, was also in Dealey Plaza. He is certain that the fatal headshot came from the grassy knoll.
Hell, I'll tell you, 90% of the people in Dallas, Texas, and probably the United States have heard all this over, have since decided that, as well as the second investigation held in the House of Representatives in Washington. And no one will ever convince me. I know damn well the shot that blew his head off came from the right front.
It had always seemed to me that had the car speeded up, had there been better reaction on the part of the driver, they were only yards from what at least I perceived to be safety by getting on the expressway. But the car seemed to it didn't move. After that first shot, it just didn't move. And the thing that has, over the years, continued to rather haunt me about the whole situation was the feeling that, did that first shot miss, as I felt it had? If it did miss, had that car speeded up, would he be alive today?
Even now, those eyewitnesses closest to the killing suffer their own haunting images from that dreadful day.
The headshot, seeing his head blow up, I can see it just as plain. It's red, it's very brilliant, it's cone-shaped, going back. That's my impression. Sad, but true.
I would agree with my mother. The headshot is so traumatic and permanently emblazoned in my mind that that and the sadness of the assassination, that'll be forever in my memory. Very sad, very traumatic.
Went over on another knoll over the other side of Dealey Plaza and just lay down on the grass and vomited, and I was just sick. And then when we took my film out to Kodak out near Love Field and saw Air Force One taking off, and I listened to it on the radio, it was hard to believe it was true. And I began wondering then, and I have never stopped wondering to this day what this world might have been like if it had not happened.
It's affected my life in many, many ways. I suppose the most immediate effect was, as I said, I stopped being in some ways young on that day. I had been very idealistic, very politically involved. I had really believed that you could make changes. I saw that it didn't really matter what you had or what you did. It could all be gone in an instant, no matter who you were or what you had to offer. It could be gone in a flash. And that's a pretty profound thing to learn at 23 years of age, that it can just end. And for reasons that you have absolutely no control over. So in a sense, I said that was the day that marked the end of my youth. And I remember one line that always struck with me at the time. It said, "The most profound of sin is tragedy unremembered." And I've never forgotten that line, and I feel almost a duty. I don't get on soapboxes and talk about it all the time, but when there is an occasion, and particularly within my own family context, I feel it's very important to remind people what happened, and that it can happen again, and that nothing in life is a guarantee.
He wasn't just the president elected by some unknown party out there. He was elected by us, the citizens of the United States of America. He was my president, and I felt very personally violated. And then to see him assassinated that way, so graphically, was horrifying. My president.
As the motorcade slowly passed the grassy knoll in Dealey Plaza, the shots rang out, and Kennedy was dead before his car reached the underpass. When the Secret Service bodyguards finally realized what had happened, there was a frantic 4-mile dash along the Stemmons Freeway to the nearest hospital. At Parkland, Kennedy was rushed to Trauma Room 1, where surgeons did everything they could to revive him, despite the massive head wound observed by Dr. Robert McClelland.
It was not a small opening at all. I would estimate that probably a quarter, or at least a fifth, of the back right side of the skull was gone.
I stepped up and looked, and I could see inside President Kennedy's head on the right side near the back. We call it the occipito-parietal area. And the scalp had been torn apart there, and the skull had been blasted open by the effect of the high-velocity missile.
I thought it was probably an exit wound because, generally speaking, high-velocity missiles of that type will enter through a rather small opening, and by creating a blast effect and by the tumbling of the bullet, it will then, as it exits the body, leave a large hole, particularly large caliber bullets like from a .45 or from a deer rifle or something of this sort would cause that kind of massive exit wound.
We had taken the casket in the room in the meantime and prepared it, and Miss Kennedy came into the room, and she was, standing there looking at him very calm, holding back tears. It's just she was emotional. I mean, never did cry, and she took her wedding ring off her finger and tried to place it on his finger. Of course, his a lot larger, and so. Struggling with, I got some K-tail jelly there that they use and greased his finger, and we got it up on his finger as far as it goes. And then the priest came into the room and administered the last rites to him.
They sent for Father Huber, and he was ushered in. There was a huge crowd, of course, milling out in the hall, and he was sort of shoved through the doors, and the scene, I'm sure, was overwhelming for him, as it was for most of us. Our president was lying there dead, his wife grief-stricken, and all of us more or less stunned. And so he came in and turned to his little book and started reciting something which he considered appropriate, and Mrs. Kennedy felt that, probably rightly so, that he wasn't giving the proper phraseology at that time, and she said, no, don't you understand? The final unction. And he turned to another place in his book and began reading, which appeared appropriate, and it seemed to have a soothing effect on her, and he finished the appropriate phrases, and Mrs. Kennedy bent over and kissed her husband and took his ring from his finger. And then she went outside the door of this small room and sat down on a chair immediately outside the room.
I didn't see the wounds. They had him completely, his head was completely wrapped in a sheet-type bandage. The body, he was nude. when we pick up a body, as we train at it, my position was to take the head, place my hand underneath the head, and the other hand goes underneath the back of the spine at the waist. Then Peanuts, his hand goes next to mine on the waist, and he gets below the knees wherever we can stretch the person out. And we picked him up, and the back of his head felt like a wet sponge. It was just real soft, and as if it was, a skull was part of his skull was missing. It was just that soft.
While the president lay dead at Parkland, another tragedy was unfolding a short distance from downtown, in the Oak Cliff district, where police officer J.D. Tippett had been gunned down by an unknown assailant.
It came out over the radio that the suspect had gone into the Texas Theater. Well, we continued on into Texas Theater, and Kenneth and I entered the theater, and about the time we entered, some more officers came in behind us, and there were also some officers around back.
While we were in the theater, probably 150 to 200 people had gathered out front of the theater, attracted there by all the noise. They had been told on television that the president had been shot. At this point, nobody knew whether he was dead or not. All these things happening this close together, they thought probably the suspect we had was maybe connected with the shooting of the president. And so we were hearing yells like, "Get him, let's kill him, let's take him." And we were all thinking, well, we just had to risk our lives and fight over a gun to get the man, and here we are, we may have to shoot somebody else to keep him.
When Oswald was first brought into the homicide office, I heard this commotion, and I looked up and I saw him. He was handcuffed with his hands handcuffed behind his back. And at that time, he refused to tell me who he was. He said something to the effect, "Well, you're the cop, you figure it out."
Later that day, Detective Rose led a search of the house in Irving, where Oswald's wife, Marina, lodged with her friend, Ruth Payne.
6 officers came to the door, and they said they had Oswald in custody for shooting an officer, no reference to the president, and they asked if they could come in. I asked if they had a warrant, and they said no, but we could get one right away, and they were obviously very tense and nervous, and I, was stunned by their arrival.
On Saturday morning, after the assassination on Friday, we went back to the Payne residence in Irving. I had obtained a search warrant from Judge Joe Brown, Jr., and wanted to do a more thorough search than I had previously done of that residence. Some of the items we found in this search was a photograph of Oswald standing in front of a house with a rifle in one hand, a newspaper in the other hand, and a pistol on his hip.
At no time did I suspect he had any kind of gun. That picture showed up later with that Marina had taken. I recognized the location as the back of their Neely Street apartment, because she'd taken me out there to pick some flowers to take home one time when I was visiting there in the spring before. And as you know, that he was carrying both the rifle and the pistol at that point.
Other items we found was, of course, a small Minox Miniature camera, it's called. It had a roll of film in it. We never did develop that film. It was later turned over to the FBI, so I don't know what turned out to be on that film.
We found a great amount of communist literature, communist books. I couldn't tell you just what all it was, but it was a large box.
We brought all the evidence in, and Captain Fritz decided to conduct a further interview of Oswald and had him brought into the homicide office for interrogation. I sat in on that interrogation. Captain Fritz at one point said, Mr. Oswald, you told us that you had never owned a rifle or a gun or a weapon of any sort. Is that right? And he said, that's right. I never owned a gun in my life. So Captain Fritz showed him the photograph and said, well, how do you explain this? He looked at it, and he got visibly mad. He seemed shaken, and he said, well, that's just simply my face superimposed on someone else's body there. That's all that is.
Another senior detective sitting in on Oswald's high-level interrogations that weekend was Jim Lavelle.
Mr. Kelly with the Secret Service who was the head of the Secret Service out of Washington, had flown in, I guess it was the next day, perhaps on Saturday, asked him if he knew anybody named Alex Heidel. He answered no, and they asked him if he had ever used that name at any time, and he answered no. And he said, well, isn't it a fact that when you were arrested you had an identification card with your picture on it and that name on it and your billfold? He said, I believe that is correct. And Mr. Kelly said, well, how do you explain that? And he said, I don't. During my tenure with him, he was a very calm and cool and collected individual. All of his answers were very concise and to the point. He didn't volunteer information, and he certainly didn't admit to anything. Mr. Kelly also, in the same time when he asked him about the Alex Heidel, he knew that Oswald had been involved in this fair play for Cuba in New Orleans. And he asked him, he said, now that the president has been killed, he says, do you think that the attitude of the United States towards Cuba will change? And Oswald looked around to his left where Captain Fritz was sitting, and he said, I believe that I am charged with the murder of the president. Is that correct? And Captain Fritz said, yes, that's true. And he turned back to Mr. Kelly and he said, I don't think that I should answer that, because whatever answer I give you might be construed in a different light than what I intended it to be. He said, however...
Robert McClelland explains.
Society worked at the time of